The wrench slipped from Frank Morrison's greasy fingers and clattered against the concrete floor of Morrison's auto repair, with a sound that echoed through the cavernous garage like a gunshot. For the third time in 2 hours, the massive Cummins X15 diesel engine had defeated him. Oil-black frustration dripped from his weathered hands as he stared at the mechanical beast that had turned his reputation into a joke among the trucking community of Bakersfield, California. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The engine belonged to a 2019 Peterbilt 579 that had rolled into his shop that morning belching smoke thick enough to choke a horse. Mike Torres, the driver, needed his rig back on the road within 6 hours to make a delivery deadline that would determine whether his small freight company survived another month. Frank had promised him a quick fix, maybe 2 hours tops. That was 4 hours ago. Now the sun hung mercilessly overhead, baking the asphalt of Highway 99 until it shimmered like water. And Frank Morrison, the man who'd built his reputation on solving impossible mechanical problems, stood defeated by an engine that seemed to mock every tool he touched. The other mechanics in his shop moved around him with the careful distance reserved for wounded animals, their usual banter replaced by uncomfortable silence. The morning had started like any other at Morrison's Auto Repair, with the familiar symphony of pneumatic tools, diesel engines, and the constant hum of industrial fans fighting against the Central Valley heat. Frank Morrison surveyed his domain from the elevated office that overlooked 8 service bays, each filled with the kind of heavy machinery that kept America's freight moving. His garage specialized in the impossible cases, the engines that other shops sent away with apologetic shrugs and referrals to the dealership. Frank took pride in being the last stop before the junkyard. Truckers drove hundreds of miles to reach his shop because when Frank Morrison said an engine could be saved, it got saved. His walls were covered with thank you letters from drivers whose livelihoods he'd rescued, photos of engines he'd rebuilt from scrap metal, and a faded newspaper clipping from 1998 when he'd rebuilt a fire-damaged semi-engine in time for a driver to make his daughter's wedding. The shop employed 6 full-time mechanics, each specializing in different aspects of heavy-duty repair. Tommy Chun, barely 25 but gifted with hydraulics, could diagnose transmission problems by sound alone. Carlos Mendez had 40 years of experience with diesel fuel systems and could rebuild an injection pump blindfolded. Jake Patterson understood electrical systems the way musicians understood rhythm, finding shorts and failed components with an intuition that bordered on supernatural. These were Frank's boys, his handpicked team of mechanical warriors who tackled problems that made other shops surrender. They worked in an environment that demanded respect through competence, where your reputation was measured by the engines you saved and the impossible problems you solved. Frank had built more than a business. He'd created a brotherhood of mechanical excellence that served as the unofficial graduate school for heavy-duty repair in Central California. When Mike Torres pulled his wounded Peterbilt into Bay 4 that Tuesday morning, trailing a cloud of blue-black smoke that spoke of serious internal damage, Frank assumed it would be just another routine challenge. The driver looked exhausted, his face carrying the strain of someone whose livelihood hung in the balance of mechanical diagnosis. Started smoking about 50 miles back, Torres explained, his voice hoarse from breathing diesel fumes through his cab's ventilation system. Temperature gauge spiked, then she started knocking like she's got hammers instead of pistons. I need her running by 3 o'clock to make my delivery window, or my contract goes to someone else. Frank nodded with the confidence of someone who'd heard similar stories hundreds of times. He assigned Carlos and Jake to the initial diagnosis, expecting them to identify a blown head gasket or failed turbocharger. Problems that looked serious but could be resolved with the right parts and a few hours of focused work. Instead, they found catastrophic internal damage. The engine had suffered complete bearing failure. Pistons had scarred the cylinder walls beyond simple repair, and the crankshaft showed stress fractures that meant the entire lower end needed rebuilding. Frank stared at the diagnostic report with growing concern. This wasn't a repair. It was major surgery that required days, not hours. "Can you do it?" Torres asked, reading the mechanical verdict in Frank's expression. Frank Morrison had never been one to back down from a challenge, and his reputation had been built on accepting impossible deadlines and delivering results. "Give me until 2 o'clock, he promised, already calculating parts availability and work sequences in his head. "We'll have you rolling by then." The next 4 hours became a masterclass in mechanical frustration. Carlos attacked the fuel system with the intensity of someone protecting his professional reputation, but the damage extended beyond his expertise into the engine's core components. Jake tackled the electrical systems that controlled fuel delivery and timing, but electrical repairs couldn't fix mechanical destruction. Tommy Chun assisted with hydraulic tools and lifting equipment, but even his specialized knowledge couldn't accelerate the fundamental work of engine rebuilding. Frank rotated between his mechanics, offering suggestions, consulting technical manuals, and applying the kind of experience that had built his reputation. Nothing worked. Every solution they attempted revealed additional problems. Each repair uncovered deeper damage, and the clock moved steadily toward Torres's deadline with ruthless indifference. By noon, the shop's usual confidence had evaporated into something approaching panic. Torres paced the customer waiting area with the restless energy of someone watching his business collapse in real time. The other truckers who'd stopped for routine maintenance began asking uncomfortable questions about delays, their confidence in Morrison's auto repair shaken by the visible signs of struggle. Frank found himself standing over the disassembled engine, studying components spread across rolling tool carts like pieces of a puzzle that refused to reveal its solution. His hands, usually steady and certain, trembled slightly as he reached for tools that seemed inadequate for the task before him. The engine that should have surrendered to his expertise instead lay in mechanical pieces that mocked his decades of experience. "Maybe we should call the dealership," Jake suggested quietly, his voice carrying the defeat of someone unaccustomed to failure. "They might have a rebuilt unit in stock." Frank's response came sharper than intended. "We don't call dealerships. We fix engines." But even as he spoke the words, he knew they sounded hollow against the evidence of their mounting failure. The shop's usual rhythm had been replaced by the awkward movements of people trying to look busy, while avoiding the obvious truth that their best efforts weren't enough. Other customers waited with increasing impatience, their routine maintenance delayed by the crisis-consuming Bay 4. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The reputation Frank had spent 30 years building felt suddenly fragile, balanced on the edge of an engine problem that refused to yield to conventional solutions. At 12:30, as Frank wiped grease from his hands for the dozenth time that day, the front door chimed with the electronic tone that announced new arrivals. Through the glass partition that separated the service area from the customer lobby, he saw Sophia Kim, their customer service representative, greeting someone at the front desk. The customer was a woman, small in stature, wearing clean work clothes that looked oddly formal compared to the oil-stained coveralls that dominated the shop environment. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to professional settings, but her presence seemed out of place in the aggressively masculine world of heavy-duty repair. Frank returned his attention to the engine problem, assuming the woman was dropping off a vehicle for routine maintenance or picking up completed work. His mind was consumed with bearing clearances and crankshaft tolerances, technical details that demanded complete focus if he hoped to meet Torres's deadline. Tommy Chun noticed her first. He'd been carrying a hydraulic cylinder to the parts cleaning station, when he caught sight of the woman through the glass partition. "Check it out," he called to Carlos, his voice carrying amusement. "Looks like someone's lost." Carlos glanced up from the fuel injection components he'd been rebuilding and followed Tommy's gaze. The woman stood at the customer counter, speaking quietly with Sophia about something that required pointing toward the service area. Her demeanor was professional, almost formal, but something about her presence triggered the casual dismissal. "That mechanic's reserved for people who clearly didn't belong in their world. Probably wants us to change her oil," Jake added from beneath the Peterbilt's hood, his voice muffled by the engine compartment, but carrying clear amusement. "Or maybe check her tire pressure." Frank barely registered the conversation. His attention was focused entirely on the mechanical carnage spread before him, components that should have revealed their secrets to his experienced eye, but instead remained stubbornly mysterious. Time was running out, his reputation was on. The line and every minute spent on distractions moved him further from the solution he desperately needed. The woman finished her conversation with Sophia and began walking toward the service area. She moved with purpose, her footsteps echoing softly against the concrete floor despite the industrial noise that filled the garage. Frank noticed her approach peripherally, but remained focused on the engine components, assuming she was looking for someone or needed directions to the restroom. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite the ambient noise of the shop. "I heard you're having trouble with a Cummins X15. Frank looked up, really seeing her for the first time. She was indeed small, perhaps 5'3", with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that suggested familiarity with working environments. Her clothes were clean, but not new, work pants and a polo shirt that looked professional without trying to impress. Most notably, her hands showed the subtle stains and calluses that spoke of actual mechanical work, not the pristine appearance of someone playing dress-up in work clothes. "We've got it handled," Frank responded automatically, his tone carrying the polite dismissal reserved for well-meaning customers who thought they could help with technical problems. "Just working through some complex issues." Tommy Chun emerged from behind a tool cart, wiping his hands on a shop rag while eyeing the woman with undisguised amusement. "Lady, this isn't exactly shade tree mechanic stuff. We're talking about a complete engine rebuild on a commercial diesel. Maybe try the quick lube place down the street if you need something fixed." The woman's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture, a subtle straightening that suggested she'd heard similar dismissals before. "I'm Elena Rodriguez," she said simply. "I specialize in Cummins engines." Carlos looked up from his workbench, his face showing the kind of patronizing patience mechanics used with customers who claimed expertise they clearly didn't possess. "Ma'am, with all due respect, this engine has bearing damage, cylinder scoring, and crankshaft problems that require specialized knowledge and equipment. It's not really something you can help with." Frank felt a flash of irritation at the interruption. Every minute spent explaining why the woman couldn't help was a minute stolen from finding the solution he needed. Torres's deadline loomed like a storm cloud, and his shop's reputation hung in the balance of an engine that seemed determined to destroy his professional standing. "Look, I appreciate the offer," Frank said, his voice carrying more edge than he intended. "But we've got 3 experienced mechanics with over 60 years of combined experience working on this problem. It's just a matter of time before we get it sorted out." Elena Rodriguez nodded slowly, her gaze moving from Frank to the disassembled engine components spread across the work area. Her eyes lingered on specific parts, the crankshaft, the bearing shells, the damaged cylinders, with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was reading the mechanical story they told. "Mind if I take a look?" she asked quietly. Tommy Chun laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive in the garage's acoustic environment. "Look all you want, lady. But unless you've got a magic wand hidden in that clean shirt, I don't think you're going to see anything we haven't already found. Jake Patterson emerged from beneath the truck's hood, his face showing the frustration of someone who'd spent hours chasing solutions that remained stubbornly elusive. No offense, but this isn't really a spectator sport. We're kind of under pressure here. Elena moved closer to the work area despite the obvious reluctance of the mechanics to accommodate her presence. She studied the engine components with methodical attention, her gaze moving from part to part in a sequence that suggested systematic diagnosis rather than casual curiosity. Frank watched her examination with growing impatience. The clock on the wall showed 12:45, leaving him with barely over an hour to achieve the impossible. Every second spent humoring the woman's curiosity was time, stolen from the desperate work of salvaging his reputation and meeting Torres's deadline. The bearing damage is extensive, Elena observed, her voice carrying the neutral tone of someone stating technical facts. But the pattern suggests lubrication failure rather than normal wear. Did you check the oil pump drive? Carlos straightened, his expression shifting from patronizing patience to mild annoyance. Of course we checked. The oil pump, that's basic diagnostic procedure. The pump's fine. It's the downstream damage that's got us tied up. Elena nodded but continued her examination, crouching beside the work area to study the crankshaft more closely. The scoring pattern on the journals is unusual. Normally you'd see uniform wear, but this looks like intermittent lubrication. Could be a restriction in the oil gallery. We checked the galleries, Jake called from across the service bay, his voice carrying the strained patience of someone explaining obvious facts to someone who didn't understand the complexity of the problem. Everything flows fine. The damage is just too extensive for quick fixes. Frank felt his jaw tighten with frustration. The woman meant well, but her amateur diagnosis was consuming precious time and distracting his mechanics from the focused work the situation demanded. Worse, her questions revealed a superficial understanding that made her confident observations seem almost insulting to professionals who dedicated their careers to understanding these exact problems. "Ma'am," Frank said, his voice carrying clear dismissal, "I really appreciate your interest, but we need to focus on getting this engine rebuilt. Maybe you could wait in the customer area while we work." Elena stood slowly, brushing dust from her work pants without apparent offense at the suggestion. Her gaze moved once more across the disassembled engine, lingering on details that seemed to capture her attention in ways Frank couldn't understand. "The oil pump drive gear," she said quietly, almost to herself. When was the last time someone actually pulled it and checked for wear? Tommy Chun stopped what he was doing and looked at her with the expression of someone whose patience had finally run out. "Lady, we've been doing this for years. We know how to diagnose oil pump problems. The gear's fine, the pump's fine, and frankly, your questions are starting to waste our time." Elena nodded once, accepting the dismissal with grace that seemed practiced. "I understand. But if you change your mind, I'll be in the waiting area." Frank watched her walk away, noting the quiet dignity with which she handled the clear rejection of her offer to help. Part of him felt a twinge of guilt at the harsh tone his mechanics had used, but the larger part remained focused on the crisis consuming his shop's attention. As Elena disappeared into the customer area, Tommy Chun shook his head with amusement. Unbelievable. Some people watch a few YouTube videos and think they can rebuild diesel engines. Carlos returned to his fuel injection work with renewed focus. At least she took the hint. Sometimes they want to stand around asking questions all day. Jake wiped his hands on a shop rag and returned his attention to the electrical components he'd been testing. Probably read an article online about engine repair and figured she could help the professionals. Frank said nothing, his attention already returned to the mechanical puzzle that refused to yield its secrets. The clock continued its relentless advance toward Torres's deadline, And every minute brought him closer to the kind of failure that could destroy a reputation built over 3 decades. In the customer waiting area, Elena Rodriguez sat quietly on a plastic chair beneath fluorescent lights that hummed with electrical persistence. She'd been dismissed, politely but firmly, by professionals who'd made reasonable assumptions about her qualifications based on her appearance and gender. Their reaction wasn't personal. It was simply the logical response of experienced mechanics protecting their workspace from well-meaning interference. But Elena Rodriguez carried knowledge that Frank Morrison's shop desperately needed: expertise, earned through years of work in environments where competence mattered more than appearance. She understood Cummins X15 engines in ways that went beyond textbook knowledge, had rebuilt dozens of them under conditions that would challenge the most experienced mechanics. She also understood that offering help to people who'd already dismissed her capabilities was futile. Instead, she settled back in her chair and waited, listening to the increasingly frustrated voices coming from the service area as Frank's team continued their struggle against an engine that refused to surrender its secrets. Time moved forward with mechanical indifference, and Elena Rodriguez waited with the patience of someone who'd learned that sometimes the best help came from those who never demanded to be heard. The temperature gauge on Frank Morrison's diagnostic computer showed 13 degrees above normal operating range as 1 o'clock approached with merciless precision. Mike Torres paced the customer waiting area like a caged animal, his cell phone pressed against his ear as he explained to his dispatcher why the promised delivery window was dissolving into mechanical impossibility. Each conversation grew more strained, his voice carrying the desperate edge of someone watching his business collapse in real time. Frank stood over the partially disassembled Cummins engine, his confidence eroding with each failed attempt to identify a workable solution. The bearing damage was worse than he'd initially diagnosed, extending deep into the engine block where specialized machining would be required. The cylinder walls showed scoring that went beyond surface repair, and the crankshaft displayed stress patterns that suggested metallurgical failure rather than simple wear. Carlos Mendez had worked on diesel engines for 4 decades, his hands carrying the accumulated wisdom of thousands of successful repairs. But the fuel injection system on Torres's Peterbilt revealed problems that cascaded through multiple components, each solution creating new complications that demanded additional time and expertise. The injection pump timing was completely disrupted. The fuel rail showed contamination that spoke of internal engine damage, and the electronic control modules registered fault codes that seemed to multiply faster than they could be cleared. "This isn't making sense," Carlos muttered, his voice carrying frustration that had been building for hours. "Every system we fix reveals 2 more problems. It's like this engine is fighting back." Jake Patterson emerged from beneath the trucks, hued, his face streaked with diesel fuel and his expression grim. The electrical systems that controlled engine timing and fuel delivery had been compromised by the catastrophic internal failure, creating a diagnostic nightmare that seemed to expand with each attempted repair. Sensors that should have provided clear readings instead delivered conflicting data. Control modules that should have responded to commands remained stubbornly uncooperative, and wiring harnesses showed signs of heat damage that suggested the engine's problems had been developing for longer than anyone realized. "The ECM is throwing codes I've never seen before," Jake reported, wiping his hands on a shop rag that had long since reached saturation with various automotive fluids. "Either this engine has problems we haven't found yet, or the computer system is completely corrupted." Tommy Chun struggled with the hydraulic systems that lifted and positioned engine components during the rebuild process. The Peterbilt's design required precise alignment of heavy parts, but the specialized lifting equipment seemed inadequate for the complex angles and clearances demanded by the repair. Each attempt to position components correctly revealed interference, problems that required additional disassembly, creating a cascade of complications that consumed precious time without producing measurable progress. Frank moved between his mechanics with increasing agitation, his usual calm command replaced by the frantic energy of someone watching his professional reputation disintegrate. The shop that had built its identity on solving impossible problems was being defeated by an engine that seemed designed to resist every conventional repair approach. "Maybe we're overthinking this," Frank suggested, his voice carrying false optimism that fooled no one. "Let's go back to basics, check our fundamentals." But the fundamentals were exactly the problem. The engine's damage was so extensive that basic repair procedures were inadequate, requiring specialized knowledge and techniques that pushed beyond the boundaries of conventional heavy-duty repair. Every manual Frank consulted offered solutions for individual problems, but none addressed the comprehensive destruction that Torres's engine presented. At 1:15, Derek Williams, the garage's business manager, appeared at Frank's shoulder with a clipboard full of increasingly urgent messages. Other customers were growing impatient with delays. Routine maintenance appointments were backing up, and the shop's reputation for reliable service was being tested by the visible chaos surrounding Bay 4. "Frank, we've got Mrs. Peterson wanting to know why her oil change is taking 3 hours," Derek reported quietly. "And the Brennan trucking fleet is here for their scheduled maintenance. They're asking if they should take their business elsewhere." Frank felt the familiar tightness in his chest that accompanied professional crisis. The engine rebuild was consuming all available resources while generating no revenue. Other customers were witnessing his team's failure in real time, and the clock continued its relentless advance toward Torres's deadline with complete indifference to human desperation. "Tell them we'll have everything sorted out within the hour," Frank replied, though even as he spoke the words, he knew they represented hope rather than realistic assessment. Derek nodded without conviction and returned to the customer service area, where conversations were becoming increasingly difficult to manage. The garage's usual atmosphere of confident competence had been replaced by something approaching panic, and experienced customers could read the signs of a shop in crisis. Carlos attempted a different approach to the fuel system problems, pulling components he'd successfully rebuilt hundreds of times before. But the contamination levels exceeded anything in his experience, requiring cleaning procedures that consumed hours without guaranteeing success. The injection nozzles were scored beyond simple cleaning. The fuel rails showed internal corrosion that demanded replacement rather than repair, and the high-pressure pumps displayed wear patterns that suggested systematic rather than isolated failure. "This fuel system is completely destroyed," Carlos announced, his voice carrying the defeat of someone unaccustomed to admitting inadequacy. "We're talking about replacing everything from the tank forward. There's no way to rebuild this in the time we have." Jake's electrical diagnosis revealed similar comprehensive failure. The engine's catastrophic breakdown had created electrical surges that damaged control modules throughout the truck systems. Repairing the mechanical problems wouldn't restore functionality if the electronic components remained corrupted, but replacing all the damaged electronics would require parts, procurement, and programming that stretched far beyond Torres's deadline. "The wiring harness is fried in 17 different locations," Jake reported, his voice hollow with exhaustion. "Even if we had replacement parts in stock, we're looking at days of electrical work just to get basic functionality restored." Tommy Chun's hydraulic struggles had revealed structural problems with the truck's frame that complicated every aspect of the engine rebuild. The mounting points showed stress damage that required welding and reinforcement before the engine could be safely reinstalled. But structural repairs demanded specialized equipment and expertise that Frank's shop didn't possess. "The engine mounts are cracked, the transmission housing is warped, and the front suspension shows signs of impact damage," Tommy explained, his usual confidence replaced by bewildered frustration. "This truck has problems we didn't even know existed when we started." Frank stared at the accumulating evidence of comprehensive mechanical failure, his mind racing through increasingly desperate solutions that all required more time than Torres's deadline allowed. The engine rebuild that had seemed challenging but manageable 6 hours earlier had revealed itself as a complete vehicle reconstruction project that would challenge the resources of a major dealership. At 1:30, Torres approached the service area with the desperate urgency of someone whose livelihood hung in the balance of mechanical diagnosis. His face showed the strain of multiple phone conversations with increasingly impatient customers, and his movements carried the restless energy of someone fighting against circumstances beyond his control. "How much longer?" Torres asked, though. His expression suggested he already knew the answer wouldn't meet his needs. Frank met the trucker's eyes with the honesty that had built his reputation, even when that honesty carried devastating news. "Mike, I'm not going to lie to you. This engine has problems we didn't anticipate. We're looking at days, not hours, to get you back on the road." Torres absorbed the information with the stoic acceptance of someone accustomed to mechanical disappointment, but his shoulders sagged with the weight of financial implications that extended far beyond simple repair costs. Missing his delivery deadline meant losing his contract, which meant losing his truck, which meant losing his independence as an owner-operator. "What are my options?" Torres asked quietly. Frank wished he had better answers to offer. "We can continue working and get you a properly rebuilt engine, but it'll take time. Or you can have it towed to the dealership and see if they have a replacement unit in stock." The dealership option carried its own problems. Replacement engines required weeks of procurement. Installation demanded specialized equipment that Frank's shop possessed, and the cost would likely exceed the truck's remaining value. Torres was trapped between impossible mechanical requirements and equally impossible financial constraints. "Let me make some calls," Torres said, walking back toward the customer area with the heavy footsteps of someone carrying burdens that had grown beyond his capacity to bear. Frank returned his attention to the engine components spread across multiple work surfaces, searching for some overlooked detail that might provide a pathway to success. His team continued their individual struggles with systems that seemed designed to resist conventional repair, their usual collaborative efficiency replaced by the desperate improvisation of people working beyond their expertise. The shop's other customers began making alternative arrangements for their mechanical needs. Mrs. Peterson finally left with her oil change incomplete, shaking her head at the chaos that had consumed Morrison's auto repair. The Brennan Trucking fleet manager walked through the service area once, observed the visible signs of crisis, and quietly moved his scheduled maintenance to a competitor. Derek Williams appeared at Frank's side again, this time carrying a different kind of urgency. "Frank, we need to talk. The Henderson account just called and canceled their contract. Word's getting around that we can't handle complex repairs anymore." Frank felt the professional foundation he'd spent 3 decades building begin to shift beneath his feet. The engine rebuild wasn't just about Torres's deadline. It was about the credibility that allowed his shop to compete for the high value work that sustained his business. Failure here would ripple through the trucking community, destroying relationships that had taken years to develop. "Give me another hour," Frank said, though he knew the request was based on desperation rather than realistic assessment of the remaining work. Carlos had exhausted his conventional approaches to fuel system repair and was attempting increasingly creative solutions that pushed beyond established procedures. His 40 years of experience provided no guidance for contamination levels that exceeded anything in his memory, and his usual confident diagnosis had been replaced by systematic guesswork that consumed time without producing results. Jake's electrical repairs had become an exercise in archaeological excavation, as he traced damaged circuits through systems that seemed to have no logical organization. The truck's wiring harnesses had been modified and repaired so many times that the original factory configuration was impossible to determine. and each attempted fix revealed additional problems that multiplied faster than they could be addressed. Tommy Chun had given up on hydraulic precision and was attempting brute force solutions that risked additional damage but offered the only hope of meeting impossible deadlines. His specialized equipment was being pushed beyond its design limits, creating new safety hazards in a shop environment that was already stressed beyond normal operating parameters. At 1:45, Frank found himself standing alone in the center of Bay 4, surrounded by the mechanical carnage that had defeated his best efforts and most experienced personnel. The engine components lay before him like pieces of a puzzle that refused to reveal its solution, mocking his decades of expertise with their stubborn resistance to conventional repair. The ambient noise of the shop had changed from the productive sounds of successful mechanical work to the frustrated cacophony of people struggling against problems that exceeded their capabilities. Pneumatic tools hissed with increasing urgency. Diagnostic equipment beeped with alarm codes that had no clear solutions, and the conversations between mechanics carried the strain of professionals confronting the limits of their knowledge. Torres sat in the customer waiting area, his cell phone silent for the first time in hours. He'd exhausted his options for deadline extensions and alternative arrangements, leaving him to watch his business collapse in real time while Frank's team continued their increasingly desperate struggle against mechanical reality. The reputation Frank had built on solving impossible problems was being tested by an engine that seemed designed to resist every conventional approach. His shop's identity as the last stop before the junkyard was being challenged by a mechanical puzzle that had turned his expertise into inadequacy and his confidence into desperate improvisation. At 2 o'clock, with Torres's deadline officially expired and no solution in sight, Frank Morrison faced the kind of professional failure that could destroy everything he'd built. The engine that should have surrendered to his team's combined expertise instead lay in pieces that seemed to multiply with each attempted repair, creating problems faster than solutions could be developed. In the customer waiting area, Elena Rodriguez continued her quiet observation of the mounting crisis. She understood the technical challenges that had defeated Frank's team, recognized the cascade of problems that had transformed a routine rebuild into comprehensive mechanical failure, and knew exactly why conventional approaches had proven inadequate for Torres's engine. She also understood that offering help to people who dismissed her capabilities would be futile until their desperation exceeded their professional pride. So she waited with practiced patience, listening to the increasingly frustrated voices from the service area, watching Torres's growing despair, and preparing for the moment when competence would matter more than assumptions about who deserved to be taken seriously. The fluorescent lights above the customer waiting area cast harsh shadows across Elena Rodriguez's face as she studied the technical manual spread across her lap. The book wasn't the glossy factory publication that most mechanics relied on, but a well-worn field guide annotated with handwritten notes accumulated over years of practical experience. The margins contained sketches of modified procedures, timing adjustments, and troubleshooting sequences that couldn't be found in any official documentation. Elena had learned early in her career that real mechanical expertise came from understanding why conventional procedures sometimes failed in developing alternative approaches that worked when textbook solutions proved inadequate. The manual in her hands represented 15 years of field experience with Cummins engines, accumulated through assignments that had taken her from remote mining operations to emergency marine repairs where failure meant stranded vessels and desperate deadlines. She'd rebuilt her first Cummins X15 in a ship's engine room 300 miles from the nearest port, working with improvised tools while the vessel wallowed in heavy seas. The job had required modifications to standard procedures that no training program could have taught, solutions developed through necessity and implemented with the kind of precision that separated competent mechanics from exceptional ones. Through the glass partition that separated the waiting area from the service bays, Elena could see Frank Morrison's team struggling with increasingly desperate measures. Their frustration was visible in every movement, audible in every conversation, and entirely predictable given the approach they were taking to Torres's engine problems. They were applying conventional solutions to unconventional damage, using standard procedures for problems that demanded creative thinking. Elena recognized the specific pattern of failure that had defeated Frank's mechanics because she'd encountered it before in marine applications where similar catastrophic bearing damage had cascaded through multiple engine systems. The contamination levels that had overwhelmed Carlos's fuel system expertise were characteristic of coolant intrusion that occurred under specific operating conditions. The electrical problems that had baffled Jake Patterson followed predictable patterns when internal engine damage created voltage fluctuations that damaged sensitive control modules. Most importantly, Elena understood that the comprehensive nature of Torres's engine failure meant that conventional rebuild procedures would be inadequate. The damage had occurred in a sequence that required repairs to be performed in a specific order, using techniques that weren't covered in standard training programs, with timing precision that demanded intimate knowledge of how Cummins engines actually functioned under extreme conditions. She closed the manual and slipped it into her canvas work bag, a gesture that felt like preparing for surgery. Elena had learned to carry her own tools to every job site, equipment selected through experience rather than purchased from catalogs. Her tool collection emphasized precision over quantity, functionality over appearance, and reliability over convenience. The socket set in her bag had been assembled piece by piece over 10 years, each component chosen for specific applications that demanded exact tolerances. The torque wrenches were calibrated monthly and marked with tape that indicated their last verification date. The measuring instruments were protected in custom foam cases that Elena had cut herself, ensuring that critical tools remained accurate despite the harsh environments where she typically worked. Elena stood and walked to the customer service desk where Sophia Kim was managing increasingly difficult conversations with delayed customers. The phone rang constantly with inquiries about service availability, and Sophia's responses had grown progressively more apologetic as the afternoon crisis deepened. "Excuse me," Elena said quietly, waiting for Sophia to finish a particularly challenging conversation with someone whose routine maintenance had been postponed indefinitely. Sophia looked up, with the strained expression of someone managing multiple crises simultaneously. "I'm sorry, but we're experiencing some delays today. If you need to reschedule your appointment, I can check our availability for next week." "I'm not here for service," Elena replied. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Morrison about the engine rebuild in Bay 4. Sophia glanced toward the service area where Frank's increasingly desperate efforts were visible through the glass partition. "I'm not sure this is the best time. They're really focused on getting that truck finished." Elena nodded understanding but didn't move away from the counter. "I think I might be able to help them with some technical issues they're encountering. Are you a mechanic?" Sophia asked, her tone carrying polite skepticism that Elena had heard countless times throughout her career. "I specialize in Cummins diesel engines," Elena answered simply. "I've worked on quite a few X15 rebuilds under difficult conditions." Sophia hesitated, caught between her instinct to protect the mechanics from additional interruptions and her recognition that Frank's team was clearly struggling beyond their normal capabilities. "Let me see if Mr. Morrison has a moment to speak with you." Elena waited while Sophia placed a brief phone call to the service area. Through the glass, she could see Frank gesturing emphatically at engine components while Carlos and Jake stood nearby with expressions that suggested they'd exhausted their conventional options. Tommy Chun was attempting to reposition a cylinder head using hydraulic equipment that appeared inadequate for the precision required. "Mr. Morrison will see you in a few minutes," Sophia reported. "He's just finishing up with something." Elena returned to her seat but didn't reopen her manual. Instead, She observed the mechanical drama unfolding in Bay 4 with the analytical attention of someone who understood exactly what was happening and why conventional approaches were proving inadequate. The damage pattern visible even from her distant vantage point told a story that Frank's team hadn't yet learned to read. At 2:15, Frank Morrison emerged from the service area with oil-stained hands and an expression that carried the weight of professional defeat. His usual confident bearing had been replaced by the frustrated energy of someone confronting problems that exceeded his expertise, and his movements showed the strain of 5 hours spent wrestling with mechanical impossibility. Sophia said, "You wanted to discuss the engine rebuild," Frank said, his tone suggesting limited patience for additional complications. Elena stood and extended her hand in a gesture that was professional rather than social. Elena Rodriguez. "I understand. You're having some challenges with the bearing damage and contamination issues." Frank shook her hand, automatically while studying her appearance with the skeptical attention that experienced mechanics reserved for people who claimed expertise they obviously didn't possess. Elena's clean clothes and professional demeanor seemed incompatible with the dirty, demanding work of heavy-duty engine repair. "We've got the situation under control," Frank replied, though his tone lacked conviction. "Just working through some complex technical issues." Elena nodded acknowledgement, but didn't accept the dismissal. "The contamination pattern you're seeing suggests coolant intrusion that occurred while the engine was operating under load. That creates a specific sequence of damage that requires non-standard repair procedures." Frank's expression shifted slightly, his skepticism tempered by surprise that Elena had diagnosed problems that had taken his team hours to identify. "How could you know about contamination patterns? You haven't even looked at the engine." "The symptoms are visible from here," Elena explained calmly. "The way your fuel system specialist is cleaning components, the electrical diagnostic equipment your technician is using, and the hydraulic positioning problems your team is encountering all indicate cascade failure from coolant contamination." Frank glanced back toward Bay 4 where his team continued their increasingly desperate efforts. Elena's casual identification of problems that had consumed his mechanic's attention for hours suggested knowledge that went beyond casual familiarity with engine repair. "Even if you're right about the contamination," Frank said, "we're talking about a complete rebuild that requires specialized equipment and procedures. This isn't exactly entry-level work." Elena reached into her work bag and withdrew a laminated card that showed her certifications from Cummins, Caterpillar, and several marine engine manufacturers. The credentials were current and extensive, representing training programs that few mechanics ever completed. More importantly, the card showed field certifications that could only be earned through hands-on work under demanding conditions. Frank studied the certifications with growing interest, recognizing qualifications that exceeded those of his own mechanics. The marine certifications were particularly impressive, indicating experience with engine repairs performed under conditions that made shop work seem comfortable by comparison. "Where did you get marine certification?" Frank asked, his tone shifting from skepticism toward professional curiosity. "Commercial fishing vessels, offshore supply boats, and emergency repairs." "At sea," Elena answered. "When an engine fails 200 miles from shore, you learn to rebuild with whatever tools and parts are available." Frank's perception of Elena began shifting as he processed the implications of her background. Marine engine repair demanded skills that went far beyond standard shop procedures, requiring mechanics to improvise solutions under conditions where failure meant genuine emergency. The certifications Elena carried represented expertise that few land-based mechanics ever developed. "What kind of non-standard procedures are you talking about?" Frank asked, his professional interest overriding his initial skepticism. Elena gestured toward the service area where Carlos was struggling with fuel system components that refused to respond to conventional cleaning procedures. Coolant contamination at operating temperature creates crystalline deposits that standard solvents can't dissolve. You need thermal cycling and specific chemical combinations that aren't covered in typical training programs. Frank followed her gaze and recognized that Carlos had indeed been struggling with contamination that resisted his usual cleaning techniques. The fuel injectors showed deposits that had proven impossible to remove despite hours of effort with industrial-grade solvents. The electrical problems your technician is encountering, Elena continued, are caused by voltage spikes that occurred when the engine's internal damage created irregular combustion pressure. The control modules are programmed to protect themselves by entering fault mode, but the standard reset procedures won't work because the underlying conditions that triggered the faults still exist. Jake Patterson's electrical struggles had indeed centered around control modules that refused to accept standard programming procedures, displaying fault codes that seemed to multiply faster than they could be cleared. Elena's explanation provided the first logical account of why conventional electrical repair procedures had proven inadequate. And the hydraulic positioning problems? Frank asked, though he suspected Elena would have an equally insightful explanation. Engine block distortion from thermal shock, Elena replied without hesitation. When coolant intrusion occurs suddenly, the temperature differential warps the block slightly. Standard mounting points don't align properly, which is why your technician is having trouble positioning components. Tommy Chun's hydraulic struggles had indeed centered around alignment problems that seemed to have no logical explanation. Engine components that should have fit precisely instead required constant adjustment and repositioning, creating delays that had frustrated him for hours. Frank realized that Elena had diagnosed in minutes problems that had consumed his team's attention for most of the day. Her explanations provided logical frameworks for failures that had seemed random and unpredictable, suggesting knowledge that went far beyond theoretical understanding of engine repair. Assuming you're right about all this, Frank said carefully, what would you suggest for repair procedures? Elena's response was immediate and specific. Thermal cleaning cycle for the fuel system components, using a controlled heat process that breaks down crystalline deposits. Progressive voltage conditioning for the electrical modules that gradually restores normal operating parameters. And precision measurement of the block distortion with compensation adjustments for mounting alignment. The procedures Elena described weren't covered in any training manual Frank had seen, but they addressed exactly the problems that had defeated his mechanics. More importantly, her explanation suggested practical experience with situations that most shop mechanics never encountered. How long would those procedures take? Frank asked, though he suspected the answer wouldn't meet Torres's already expired deadline. For an experienced team working with proper procedures, about 4 hours start to finish, Elena answered. But only if you know exactly what sequence to follow and have access to the right equipment and materials. Frank felt a mixture of hope and frustration. Elena's proposed timeline was impossibly optimistic, given that his team had already spent 5 hours making virtually no progress, but her diagnostic accuracy suggested knowledge that might actually provide solutions. We don't have 4 hours, Frank admitted. The customer's deadline expired an hour ago, and every minute we delay costs him money he can't afford to lose. Elena nodded understanding but didn't seem discouraged by the time pressure. Emergency procedures can accelerate the process significantly if you're willing to accept some risk and work outside standard safety margins. What kind of risk? Frank asked, though his desperation was beginning to outweigh his caution. Thermal cleaning at accelerated temperatures, electrical conditioning without full diagnostic verification, and mechanical assembly with calculated tolerance rather than precision measurement, Elena explained. Faster, but requiring experience to avoid damage that would make the engine unrepairable. Frank weighed Elena's proposal against the mounting evidence that his team's conventional approaches were inadequate. Torres's deadline had already passed. Other customers were growing impatient with delays, and his shop's reputation was being damaged with each hour of visible failure. "How much experience do you have with emergency procedures?" Frank asked. Elena's response was matter-of-fact rather than boastful. 15 years of field work in conditions where failure meant stranded vessels, missed shipping schedules, and sometimes genuine safety emergencies. "I've rebuilt engines in storm conditions with improvised tools and under time pressure that made shop deadlines seem comfortable." Frank studied Elena's expression, searching for signs of overconfidence or exaggeration that might indicate she was promising more than she could deliver. Instead, he saw the calm competence of someone who'd faced genuine mechanical emergencies and developed the skills necessary to solve problems under extreme conditions. "What would you need from us?" Frank asked, his tone suggesting he was seriously considering Elena's offer. "Access to your equipment, cooperation from your team, and permission to work outside standard procedures when necessary," Elena answered. "Also understanding that emergency techniques carry risks that normal shop work doesn't involve." Frank glanced toward Bay 4, where his team continued their increasingly futile efforts against an engine that had defeated their best attempts. Carlos was repeating cleaning procedures that had already proven inadequate. Jake was running the same diagnostic routines that had provided no useful information, and Tommy Chun was attempting hydraulic adjustments that created new problems faster than they solved existing ones. "Let me talk to my team," Frank said, though his tone suggested he'd already made his decision. Elena nodded and returned to her seat in the waiting area, understanding that Frank needed to prepare his mechanics for the possibility that their expertise might be inadequate for the current challenge. She also understood that accepting help from someone they'd dismissed would require them to acknowledge that their assumptions about competence and gender had been incorrect. In Bay 4, Frank gathered his 3 mechanics for a conversation that would challenge everything they thought they knew about professional hierarchy and mechanical expertise. The woman they'd laughed at possessed knowledge that might save Torres's deadline and salvage the shop's reputation, but only if they could overcome their pride long enough to let her demonstrate what she actually knew about rebuilding engines under impossible conditions. Elena Rodriguez rolled up her sleeves with methodical precision as she approached Bay 4, her movements carrying the controlled urgency of someone who understood exactly how much work needed to be accomplished and exactly how little time remained to complete it. The canvas tool bag slung across her shoulder contained instruments that most mechanics had never seen, equipment designed for precision work under conditions where conventional tools proved inadequate. Frank Morrison stood beside the disassembled engine with an expression that mixed desperate hope with professional skepticism. His decision to allow Elena access to the rebuild had been driven by mounting evidence that his team's expertise was insufficient for Torres's engine problems, but accepting help from someone he'd initially dismissed required him to acknowledge that his assumptions about competence had been fundamentally flawed. Carlos Mendez watched Elena's approach with unconcealed resentment, his 40 years of experience telling him that no one could accomplish in minutes what had taken him hours to attempt. The fuel system components spread across his workbench represented the accumulated frustration of an expert encountering problems that exceeded his knowledge, and the suggestion that some unknown woman could succeed where he'd failed struck at the core of his professional identity. Jake Patterson observed Elena's preparation with the wary attention of someone whose electrical expertise had been proven inadequate by an engine that refused to respond to standard diagnostic procedures. His diagnostic equipment sat idle, displaying fault codes that seemed to multiply with each attempted repair, mocking his decades of training with their stubborn resistance to conventional solutions. Tommy Chun had positioned himself near the hydraulic equipment with defensive body language that suggested he expected Elena to criticize his positioning techniques. His specialized tools lay scattered across the work area, evidence of increasingly desperate attempts to achieve alignment that seemed to violate basic mechanical principles. Elena surveyed the work area with systematic attention, her gaze moving from component to component in a sequence that suggested she was reading the mechanical story that Torres's engine told. The pattern of damage wasn't random. It followed predictable pathways that experienced mechanics should have recognized. But the complexity of the cascade failure had overwhelmed conventional diagnostic approaches. "The first step is understanding what actually happened to this engine," Elena said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who diagnosed similar problems before. "The damage pattern tells us that cooling system failure occurred while the engine was operating under maximum load, probably during extended highway driving in hot weather." She pointed to specific areas of the crankshaft where bearing damage showed characteristic patterns. "See how the scoring is heaviest on the thrust surfaces but minimal on the load-bearing areas? That indicates lubrication failure caused by coolant contamination, not normal wear or inadequate oil pressure." Carlos moved closer despite his resentment, professional curiosity overriding his wounded pride. The bearing damage Elena described was indeed distributed in ways that his conventional diagnosis had missed, patterns that suggested causes he hadn't considered. Elena withdrew a small digital device from her tool bag, equipment that looked sophisticated beyond typical shop instrumentation. "This measures thermal conductivity in metal components, coolant contamination changes, the molecular structure of bearing materials in ways that standard visual inspection can't detect." She placed the device against several bearing shells, watching readouts that provided information invisible to conventional inspection techniques. The numbers confirmed what her experience had suggested about the nature and extent of contamination that had caused the catastrophic failure. "These bearings can't be cleaned using standard procedures," Elena explained. "The contamination has bonded at the molecular level, creating deposits that will cause immediate failure if we try to reuse them. But the crankshaft itself can be salvaged using thermal restoration techniques." Frank watched Elena's diagnostic process with growing amazement. Her equipment and procedures revealed information that his team's conventional approaches had completely missed, providing logical explanations for problems that had seemed random and unpredictable. Elena moved to the fuel system components that had frustrated Carlos for hours. She examined the injection nozzles under a magnifying device that incorporated LED lighting and digital measurement capabilities, equipment that transformed visual inspection into precise technical analysis. "The contamination here is crystalline. Deposits formed when coolant mixed with diesel fuel at operating temperature," she explained. "Standard solvents can't dissolve these formations because they're chemically bonded to the metal surfaces. But they'll respond to thermal cycling combined with specific pH-balanced cleaning agents." She withdrew several bottles from her tool bag, each labeled with technical specifications rather than commercial brand names. The chemicals were specialized compounds that weren't available through normal parts channels, solutions developed for marine applications where equipment failure in remote locations demanded innovative repair techniques. Carlos watched Elena begin a cleaning process that involved procedures he'd never seen before. She connected the fuel injection components to a portable heating device that could control temperature with precision impossible using conventional shop equipment. The thermal cycling she described involved heating and cooling the parts in controlled sequences while applying cleaning agents at specific intervals. "While that's processing, we can address the electrical issues," Elena said, moving toward Jake's diagnostic equipment with confidence that suggested she understood his problems before examining his work. Elena connected her own diagnostic device to the truck's electrical system, equipment that bypassed the standard communication protocols that had frustrated Jake's repair attempts. Her scanner displayed information in formats that provided deeper insight into the control module failures that had baffled conventional diagnosis. The voltage spikes that damaged these modules occurred in patterns that follow specific timing sequences, Alina explained as data streamed across her device's screen. The control units are protecting themselves by refusing normal communication, but they'll respond to graduated voltage conditioning that gradually restores normal operating. Parameters. Jake watched Alina implement electrical procedures that weren't covered in any training manual he'd seen. Her approach bypassed safety protocols that would normally prevent the kind of direct intervention she was performing, techniques that carried significant risk if implemented incorrectly but offered the possibility of restoring functionality that conventional repairs couldn't achieve. "This is pretty aggressive stuff," Jake observed, his professional concern overriding his defensive posture. "If you miscalculate the voltage parameters, you could destroy the remaining functional circuits." Alina nodded acknowledgement without slowing her work. Emergency procedures always involve calculated risks. The alternative is complete module replacement, which would take days to procure and program. We're working with damaged components that are partially functional, trying to restore enough capability to meet minimum operating requirements. Her electrical work proceeded with methodical precision that suggested extensive experience with unconventional repair techniques. Each adjustment was measured and recorded, creating systematic documentation of procedures that could be reversed if complications developed. Meanwhile, the fuel system components continued their thermal cleaning cycle under Alina's monitoring. The process involved temperature and chemical combinations that went beyond standard safety guidelines, requiring constant attention to prevent damage that would make the parts irreparable. Tommy Chun watched Alina's diagnostic approach to his hydraulic alignment problems with grudging interest. She used precision measuring equipment to quantify the block distortion that had frustrated his positioning efforts, providing numerical data that explained why conventional mounting procedures had proven inadequate. The thermal shock created expansion patterns that shifted the mounting points by approximately 2 millimeters, Alina explained as she documented the measurements. Within normal tolerance for most applications, but enough to prevent proper component alignment during assembly. She withdrew a set of specialized shims from her tool kit, precision machined components that most shops didn't stock. The shims were designed to compensate for exactly the kind of distortion that Torres's engine displayed, allowing proper alignment despite the block's deviation from factory specifications. "These will restore proper mounting geometry," Alina said, beginning installation procedures that required coordination between her measurement work and Tommy's hydraulic positioning. But the assembly sequence has to be modified to accommodate the compensation adjustments. Alina's approach to the engine rebuild violated conventional procedures in multiple ways, but each deviation was based on specific technical rationale that addressed problems conventional methods couldn't solve. Her work proceeded with systematic efficiency that suggested she'd performed similar emergency repairs many times before. The fuel injection components completed their thermal cleaning cycle with results that amazed Carlos. Deposits that had resisted hours of conventional cleaning dissolved completely, revealing component surfaces that looked nearly new despite their obvious age and wear. Alina's unconventional procedures had restored functionality that standard techniques couldn't achieve. "How did you know those specific temperature cycles would work?" Carlos asked, his resentment replaced by professional curiosity about techniques that exceeded his experience. "Trial and error over 15 years of field work," Alina answered while inspecting the cleaned components. "Marine environments present contamination problems that land-based mechanics rarely encounter. You learn alternative procedures because conventional techniques aren't adequate for the conditions." Alina's electrical conditioning procedures were producing similar results. Jake's diagnostic equipment showed control modules gradually returning to normal communication protocols as her voltage restoration techniques overcame the protective shutdown modes that had frustrated conventional repair attempts. The modules are responding to the conditioning, Jake reported, his tone carrying amazement that Elena's aggressive procedures were working without causing additional damage. Fault codes are clearing systematically, and communication protocols are stabilizing. Elena monitored the electrical restoration process while beginning mechanical assembly procedures that incorporated Tommy's precision shimmed alignment corrections. Her work required coordination between multiple systems that were being repaired simultaneously, demanding attention to detail that went beyond normal shop procedures. Frank observed Elena's coordinated approach with growing understanding of why his team's individual efforts had proven inadequate. The engine's problems were interconnected in ways that required simultaneous repair of multiple systems, using techniques that went beyond conventional training but addressed the root causes of cascade failure. "This is incredible work," Frank admitted, his initial skepticism replaced by professional admiration for Elena's expertise. "Where did you learn these procedures?" Elena continued her assembly work while answering. "Necessity. When you're 300 miles from shore and an engine fails, you develop whatever techniques are required to restore functionality. Conventional procedures assume access to proper facilities and unlimited time. Field work teaches you to improvise solutions using available resources." The engine rebuild proceeded with systematic efficiency that transformed the mechanical chaos of the previous hours into organized progress toward functional restoration. Elena's procedures addressed each problem with specific techniques developed through experience that went far beyond textbook knowledge. Carlos began reassembling fuel system components with newfound respect for Elena's cleaning procedures. The injection nozzles showed none of the contamination that had frustrated his conventional approaches, and the fuel rails assembled with precision that suggested complete restoration of factory specifications. Jake watched his diagnostic equipment display increasingly normal readings as Elena's electrical conditioning procedures restored full functionality to control modules that had seemed irreparably damaged. Her unconventional techniques had achieved results that conventional electrical repair couldn't match. Tommy Chun coordinated his hydraulic positioning with Elena's modified assembly procedures, finding that her precision measurements and compensation shims allowed perfect component alignment despite the engine block's thermal distortion. Problems that had frustrated him for hours were resolved through techniques that addressed underlying causes rather than symptoms. Elena's systematic approach to the engine rebuild demonstrated expertise that went beyond mechanical knowledge into understanding of how complex systems failed and could be restored under emergency conditions. Her work proceeded with confidence that came from extensive experience with problems that challenged conventional repair techniques. At 3:30, less than 90 minutes after Elena had begun her emergency procedures, Torres's Cummins X15 diesel engine stood completely rebuilt and ready for testing. The transformation from mechanical catastrophe to functional power plant had been accomplished using techniques that none of Frank's mechanics had seen before, procedures that addressed problems conventional methods couldn't solve. "Let's see if it runs," Elena said, her tone carrying the calm confidence of someone who understood exactly what she'd accomplished and why her procedures should have restored full functionality. Frank activated the engine starting sequence while his entire team gathered around Bay 4 to witness the moment that would determine whether Elena's emergency rebuild had actually solved the comprehensive problems that had defeated their conventional approaches. The engine turned over once, twice, then caught with the steady rhythm that indicated complete restoration of mechanical functionality. No smoke emerged from the exhaust, no unusual noises suggested remaining problems, and the diagnostic equipment displayed readings that confirmed normal operation across all monitored systems. Torres stood in the customer area with an expression that mixed disbelief with overwhelming relief as he watched his rebuilt engine run with smooth efficiency that indicated complete restoration of its original capabilities. The deadline that had seemed impossibly lost was suddenly achievable again, his business rescued from mechanical disaster by techniques that had seemed like impossible promises just hours earlier. Elena methodically cleaned her tools and returned them to her canvas bag, while the engine continued its steady operation, proof that her emergency procedures had accomplished what conventional repair techniques couldn't achieve. Her work had transformed Frank Morrison's shop from a place of mounting failure into a demonstration of what was possible when expertise met genuine emergency conditions. The steady rumble of Torres's rebuilt Cummins engine filled Morrison's auto repair with a sound that spoke of complete mechanical restoration. Elena Rodriguez stood beside the Peterbilt, monitoring diagnostic readings that confirmed what everyone could hear. The engine was running with factory-level precision, despite having been completely destroyed just hours earlier. The transformation from mechanical catastrophe to perfect operation had been accomplished using techniques that challenged everything Frank Morrison's team thought they knew about heavy-duty repair. Frank stared at the diagnostic display with an expression that mixed professional amazement with something approaching disbelief. Every parameter showed normal operating ranges, the kind of readings that indicated not just functional repair, but complete restoration of the engine's original capabilities. The comprehensive failure that had defeated his most experienced mechanics had been resolved by procedures he'd never seen before, implemented by someone his team had initially dismissed as unqualified. Carlos Mendez approached the fuel system monitoring equipment with the careful attention of someone examining evidence that contradicted his fundamental understanding of diesel repair. The injection pressures were perfect, fuel flow patterns showed no restrictions, and the contamination levels that had frustrated his cleaning efforts for hours had been completely eliminated. Elena's thermal cleaning procedures had accomplished what his 40 years of experience couldn't achieve. "I've never seen fuel system restoration this complete," Carlos admitted, his voice carrying the humility of someone whose expertise had been proven inadequate. "Those cleaning techniques shouldn't be possible with the equipment we have in this shop." Elena finished recording final diagnostic readings in a notebook that contained documentation of her repair procedures. Her notations were precise and technical, creating a record that could be understood by other mechanics who might encounter similar problems. The emergency techniques she'd employed carried risks that required careful documentation for future reference. "The thermal cycling equipment is portable," Elena explained while securing her specialized tools in their protective cases. "Designed for field work where conventional cleaning facilities aren't available. Most of the procedures I used were developed for marine applications where equipment failure means genuine emergency situations." Jake Patterson studied the electrical diagnostic readings with fascination that overcame his earlier defensive posture. The control modules that had refused to respond to his conventional programming procedures were now communicating normally, displaying operational parameters that indicated complete restoration of electronic functionality. "How did you know the voltage conditioning sequences?" Jake asked, his professional curiosity overriding his wounded pride. "Those procedures aren't covered in any training manual I've seen." Elena's response was matter-of-fact rather than boastful. "Emergency electrical work requires understanding how control modules actually function under stress conditions. Standard training focuses on normal operations, but field work teaches you what happens when systems fail and how to restore functionality when conventional procedures aren't adequate." Tommy Chun examined the precision alignment that Elena's shimming techniques had achieved, marveling at how her measurements and compensation adjustments had resolved hydraulic positioning problems that had frustrated him for hours. The engine components were perfectly aligned despite the thermal distortion that had made conventional mounting procedures impossible. This level of precision should require machine shop equipment, Tommy observed, running his hands along mounting surfaces that showed factory-level alignment. How did you achieve these tolerances with hand tools? Elena demonstrated the measuring instruments she'd used, precision devices that provided accuracy impossible with conventional shop equipment. Marine work requires portable solutions for problems that land-based shops solve with stationary machinery. You learn to achieve precision using equipment that can be carried to remote locations. Mike Torres stood beside his rebuilt truck with an expression that mixed overwhelming relief with profound gratitude. His business had been rescued from mechanical disaster by someone whose expertise exceeded anything he'd encountered in 2 decades of trucking. The deadline that had seemed impossibly lost was now achievable, his freight contract saved by techniques that had seemed like magic just hours earlier. "What do I owe you for this?" Torres asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. "You just saved my entire business." Elena's response surprised everyone within hearing distance. "Nothing. I was glad to help when conventional approaches weren't working." Frank Morrison felt his understanding of professional competence shift fundamentally as he processed what Elena had accomplished. Her expertise went beyond mechanical knowledge into understanding of how complex systems could be restored under conditions that defeated conventional repair techniques. More importantly, her willingness to help without compensation demonstrated professionalism that exceeded his own team's approach to difficult problems. "We need to discuss compensation," Frank insisted, recognizing that Elena's work had value that extended far beyond the immediate engine rebuild. "What you've accomplished here isn't routine mechanical work." Elena finished packing her specialized equipment, while the rebuilt engine continued its steady operation. "Consider it professional courtesy. Sometimes the best payment is knowing that someone got back on the road when they needed to." Derek Williams appeared from the business office carrying documentation that would record Elena's contribution to the engine rebuild. His paperwork showed the systematic thoroughness of someone who understood that extraordinary work deserved official recognition, even when the expert who'd performed it preferred to remain anonymous. "We need your certifications for our insurance." "Records," Derek explained, offering forms that would document Elena's qualifications and the procedures she'd used. "This level of repair work requires proper documentation for warranty and liability purposes." Elena provided the necessary information with professional efficiency, her credentials confirming expertise that extended far beyond what anyone in Frank's shop possessed. The Marine certifications were particularly impressive, representing training and experience that few land-based mechanics ever achieved. Word of Elena's remarkable engine rebuild began spreading through Morrison's auto repair with the kind of organic communication that occurred when people witnessed something genuinely extraordinary. Customers who'd been waiting for routine maintenance gathered near Bay 4 to observe the perfectly running engine that had been completely destroyed. Just hours earlier, Mrs. Patterson, whose oil change had been delayed by the engine crisis, approached Elena with the respectful attention of someone recognizing genuine expertise. "I've never seen anything like what you just accomplished. Where did you learn to work like that?" Elena's response was characteristically modest. 15 years of field work in conditions where equipment failure meant serious problems. "You develop whatever skills are necessary to keep engines running when conventional repair isn't possible." The conversation attracted other customers who'd witnessed the transformation of Frank's shop from crisis to success. Their questions revealed genuine curiosity about Elena's background and the techniques she'd employed to achieve results that had seemed impossible. A teenage apprentice from the neighboring garage had been watching Elena's work through the service bay doors, his attention captured by procedures he'd never seen before. His questions demonstrated the kind of eager interest that suggested Elena's techniques might influence how future mechanics approached complex repair problems. "Are those procedures you could teach?" the apprentice asked, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone encountering expertise that exceeded his training. Or do they require special equipment that most shops don't have? Elena considered the question carefully before responding. Some techniques require specialized equipment, but the diagnostic approach can be learned by anyone willing to understand how systems actually fail rather than just following standard procedures. Frank recognized that Elena's visit represented more than successful engine repair. It was a demonstration of expertise that challenged his understanding of what was possible in heavy-duty mechanical work. Her technique suggested knowledge that went beyond conventional training into practical experience that few mechanics ever developed. "Would you consider consulting on difficult cases?" Frank asked, his tone suggesting genuine interest in maintaining contact with someone whose expertise exceeded his shop's capabilities. "We encounter problems that push beyond conventional repair techniques." Elena's response was non-committal but not dismissive. "I travel quite a bit for marine work, but I'm always interested in challenging mechanical problems. Sometimes the difficult cases teach you things that routine work never reveals." The afternoon shift change brought new personnel into Morrison's auto repair. Mechanics who observed the perfectly running Peterbilt engine with curiosity about how Frank's team had resolved problems that had seemed insurmountable just hours earlier. Their questions revealed that word of Elena's remarkable repair work was spreading beyond the immediate shop environment. Carlos approached Elena with an expression that mixed professional respect with genuine curiosity about techniques that had exceeded his experience. "Would you mind sharing some insights about those thermal cleaning procedures? I'd like to understand how to recognize when conventional approaches won't be adequate." Elena's willingness to share knowledge demonstrated the kind of professional generosity that built respect within mechanical communities. Her explanations were technical but accessible, providing information that experienced mechanics could understand and potentially apply to their own challenging repair situations. Jake Patterson expressed similar interest in Elena's electrical conditioning techniques, recognizing that her procedures addressed problems that conventional training didn't cover. Those voltage restoration sequences could be valuable for other control module failures. Are they documented anywhere? Elena produced a technical notebook that contained detailed records of procedures she'd developed through years of field experience. The documentation was thorough and precise, representing knowledge that had been accumulated through practical application rather than theoretical study. Tommy Chun studied Elena's precision measurement techniques with professional fascination, understanding that her portable equipment provided capabilities that most shops achieved only with stationary machinery. This kind of precision could solve alignment problems that we usually send to machine shops. Elena demonstrated her measuring instruments with the patience of someone who understood that sharing knowledge strengthened the entire mechanical profession. Her equipment represented technological solutions to problems that challenged conventional shop capabilities. Torres completed his final inspection of the rebuilt engine with satisfaction that extended beyond simple mechanical function. Elena's work had restored his truck to better condition than it had shown in months, addressing problems that had been developing gradually before the catastrophic failure brought them to crisis. "This engine runs better than it has since I bought the truck," Torres observed, his voice carrying amazement that exceeded simple gratitude. "Whatever you did went beyond just fixing the immediate problems." Elena's comprehensive approach to engine repair had indeed addressed underlying issues that conventional rebuilds often overlooked. Her diagnostic procedures had identified and corrected problems that would have caused future failures if left unresolved. At 4:30, Torres drove his rebuilt Peterbilt out of Morrison's auto repair, with plenty of time to meet his rescheduled delivery deadline. The engine that had seemed beyond salvation 6 hours earlier now ran with smooth efficiency that indicated complete restoration of its original capabilities. Elena gathered her remaining equipment while Frank's team processed what they'd witnessed. Her demonstration of expertise had challenged their assumptions about competence and gender while providing techniques that exceeded their conventional training. "We owe you more than we can express," Frank said, his voice carrying sincere appreciation. For someone who'd rescued his shop's reputation from professional disaster, "Your work here will be remembered for a long time." Elena's departure was as quiet as her arrival had been, but the impact of her visit would influence Morrison's auto repair long after she'd moved on to whatever assignment came next. She'd proven that expertise could emerge from unexpected sources, that conventional assumptions about competence could be wrong, and that sometimes the most extraordinary solutions came from people who'd learned to work outside standard procedures. Frank watched Elena's vehicle disappear into the Bakersfield traffic with recognition that he'd witnessed something genuinely remarkable. The woman his team had initially dismissed as unqualified had demonstrated expertise that exceeded anything. In his 30 years of experience, using techniques that challenged fundamental assumptions about what was possible in heavy-duty repair, the rebuilt Cummins engine continued running in the background, its steady operation serving as proof that Elena Rodriguez had accomplished what seemed impossible. Her visit had transformed Frank's understanding of professional competence while providing his shop with techniques that would influence how they approached complex problems for years to come. In the weeks that followed, word of Elena's remarkable engine rebuild spread through the Central Valley trucking community with the kind of organic communication that occurred when people witnessed genuine expertise. Frank's shop began receiving requests for similar emergency repairs, customers who'd heard about the woman who could rebuild engines using techniques that exceeded conventional capabilities. Elena Rodriguez herself remained elusive, appearing at various locations throughout California wherever marine or emergency mechanical work demanded expertise that conventional shops couldn't provide. Her reputation grew through stories told by people who'd witnessed her work, but she maintained the quiet professionalism that had characterized her visit to Morrison's auto repair. The engine rebuild that had seemed impossible became a reference point for excellence in heavy-duty repair, proof that extraordinary competence could emerge from unexpected sources when expertise met genuine emergency conditions. Elena's demonstration that gender and appearance were irrelevant to mechanical capability influenced how Frank's team evaluated professional qualifications for the rest of their careers. Frank Morrison's shop never forgot the day when a small woman had accomplished what his experienced team couldn't achieve, using knowledge that exceeded their training and techniques that challenged their understanding of what was possible in mechanical repair. Elena Rodriguez had proven that true expertise spoke louder than assumptions, that competence needed no introduction, and that sometimes the most extraordinary solutions came from the most unlikely sources. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.